After a career in investment management and some time as a credit risk specialist at the US Treasury Department, Jill Eicher has written her first book. Title: Mellon versus Churchill, the untold story of Treasury titans at war. It's all about collection of war debts from World War I, which was fought between 1914 and 1918. Andrew Mellon, a wealthy industrialist, served as Secretary of the Treasury for Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, 11 years total. Mellon took on Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill. Jill Eicher tells a story that will be new to most readers. Jill Eicher, who was Andrew Mellon?
He was way back in 1921 when he came to serve in the US Department of Treasury. He was virtually unknown outside of Pittsburgh. He was a pioneering venture capitalist, recognized one of the best bankers in the United States. And at that time, he was at retirement age in his mid-60s when he did come to Washington to take up his appointment at Treasury. And he was a very reserved, reticent man, highly analytical, and a great listener. And he came to Washington thinking he might do something to the good. Those were his own words.
Philander Knox was what relation to the story you're telling?
He was a personal friend of Mellon after having been his lawyer for decades, like Mellon from Pittsburgh. And a very accomplished lawyer. He served in the Taft administration. He had been Secretary of State, very highly respected in the Senate, and a very thoughtful writer. And he was very passionate about the United States and its role in the world, and wrote very extensively on what he believed the United States should be in terms of its role in the global marketplace.
What did he do with Andrew Mellon?
He represented Mellon as Mellon's lawyer in his corporate businesses. Mellon served on the board of almost 60 different corporations and typically had very extensive equity interests in those businesses. Many of those businesses were founded with Mellon Bank money, and Knox was one of the legal architects of those relationships.
How did Warren Harding get interested in him, meaning Andrew Mellon?
Harding knew virtually nothing about Mellon to start with. And I believe that there's a cute story that Knox very much believed that Mellon wasn't ready for retirement at all. And this was at the time when these early post-war years, there was great economic dislocation, and the Wilson administration had been very active in crafting a vision for the role for the United States, a vision that Knox did not agree with at all. And this had to do with the Versailles Treaty and the organization of the League of Nations. And Wilson had been the visionary behind that. Knox was one of his most harsh critics and believed that it was absolutely wrong for the United States to join the League of Nations. And he believed that Harding, who shared that opinion somewhat, he was more of a middle of the road thinker on that topic. Knox felt that, number one, Andrew Mellon would be good for the country as far as trying to return to more stable economics in the United States and the world. And he also knew that Mellon shared his opinion that joining the League of Nations would have been a mistake for the United States. And so it was Knox who suggested and actually campaigned for Mellon to be first suggested as a candidate for the position. And it was Knox who really brought it across the line. Excuse me.
What did Andrew Mellon look like?
Mellon was a diminutive man in today's standards. He stood about 5 feet 6 inches tall. People described him as frail and very lean. He was very fit. He was a man who walked back and forth from Treasury to his apartment in DuPont Circle twice a day, every day. And he had a gray silver hair and a very distinctive gray mustache and deep set eyes. And as I said, he was a great listener. He was very serious in his approach to people. When you would speak with him, he gave you his full attention. He really was taking in every word. But to some people, he appeared diffident because he would be listening intently, and he was not a man who was able to express emotion well. But he was a man who was able to really comprehend very quickly complex ideas.
I'm going to jump.
Excuse me.
I was just going to say, I'm going to jump way ahead only to show. I mean, he was there 11 years as Secretary of the Treasury. Who wanted to impeach him at the end?
It was a man by the name of Mr. Patman. He was a congressman. And when Mellon was first talking with Knox about taking the job at Treasury, Mellon was very concerned because of all of his business interests, how that would work. Was it even legal? And it was Knox and his legal partner who assured Mellon that that would not be a problem, and that Mellon did actually resign from most of those board seats that he sat on. But there were members in Congress who felt that he had an inherent conflict of interest because of the depth of those business interests. And they felt that the opportunity for self-dealing was there on many, many different issues. And they felt that Mellon hadn't actually been truthful in saying he had resigned from those positions. And there was some truth to that. Mellon was technically, he had stepped back from his businesses, but he and his brother still communicated. He was still passionately interested in those businesses. But I think that he was not able to persuade some of the members of Congress who felt that there was a conflict, that he was not, that he, first of all, it was legal for him to become Treasury Secretary, and second, that he was a man of integrity.
Just for context, I looked up how much, I asked the question to the Google machine, how much is the Mellon family worth today? And they told me 25 billion. So the money is still there for people that want to, as they hear about Andrew Mellon's life back in the 20s. How did you, this is your first book. How did you get to this subject for your first book?
I really feel like the story found me. I was doing research on a completely different topic. And in the course of doing that research, I came upon a New York Times article, very short, that said the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, hosted a dinner for Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon at the London Ritz Hotel. This was in 1926. And I had been researching Mellon and Churchill for a completely different reason. I was interested in public-private partnerships, and Mellon had been involved, of course, in founding the National Gallery of Art, which is one of the most successful public-private partnerships in the United States. And Winston Churchill made an investment on behalf of the British government in a company called Anglo-Persia Oil Company, that was a very successful public-private partnership. It became British Petroleum. And so I had been looking at them because I was fascinated with the two different partnerships. And as I had kind of dug into it, I came upon some information that showed that they had some shared interests. And when I read the New York Times article, I asked myself, well, is there any possibility that these two extraordinary people were friends? And that led to some more digging. And I thought perhaps because of their interest, Mellon, of course, ran Gulf Oil. I thought perhaps oil might have been a shared interest. And of course, Churchill, he was a hobby painter, but he had become quite proficient. So I thought maybe it was art. I could not have been more wrong. As I continued to research, and I discovered that they had been locked in an epic battle of wills over the repayment of war debts from World War I. And that is when I realized, well, this is a completely different story than I imagined. And I struggled, though, to find some type of confirmation. And I was very fortunate that the International Churchill Society extended a grant to me to continue the research to find out about this relationship between Mellon and Churchill. That led to writing a paper. Then the Churchill and Society invited me to present the research and on a Zoom call like this, and that led to Sita Seltzer, who has been to have zoomed in on that call, to introducing me to her publisher. And I'm one of the most fortunate new authors ever, I believe.
Is it fair? As I read the book, it's one of the first times I can remember, and I've done a lot of Winston Churchill books, that he does not come off well. He comes off as being very nasty to this country, saying things that I've never seen him say before, because he's always portrayed as somebody that, his mother was an American and all this stuff, and he was very close to them. And of course, you include in your book very positive comments that he says about the United States. But what about all these negative things that he was saying?
That came from, I believe, sincere frustration. In the years, say 1919, 1920, right after the end of World War I, the Allies were very concerned about war debts because they were so large. And Churchill was one of those people. And Wilson's vision for the League of Nations and all of the nations coming together in the interest of peace forever, so there would never be wars again, The Allies, of course, loved that notion, but they also loved the idea of American leadership. And they wanted to wipe the war debts off the books. The United States, this was a very, very big loan that was made to the Allies. It represented at the time half of the national debt of the United States. And the overtures that were made by the British governments and the French government to the Wilson administration had overtures of the right thing to do is to cancel the debts. And that was something that Wilson actually directly told Prime Minister Lloyd George, that the American people would never agree to that, nor would Congress. And the American people had been promised that the loans would be repaid. And the Allies, they were working under the assumption from the beginning that the war debts, surely the United States would forgive them. It was their assumption. And of course, it was the assumption of the Harding administration, the Coolidge administration, the Hoover administration, that since they signed the loan documents with a promise to pay the interest on top of it, that surely they would repay. And that's what set up the conflict, that there were two entirely different perspectives on the war debts. And I believe that Churchill, who was involved through all of those negotiations, and saw the United States saying no time and time again to discussing the idea of canceling the debts. I think he and Lloyd George had come to the conclusion that the United States was absolutely intent on demanding repayment, and Churchill was the first person in the cabinet to realize what this would mean economically, that it really would. Not only did the war cost them blood and treasure, men and their wealth, but now Britain's financial supremacy in the world would be ceded to the United States if the United States really did demand repayment. And that, I believe, was just an unimaginable cost in Churchill's mind. And he was very angry about it, very indignant about it. He believed the United States policy was wrong on every level. And so I think that explains where he was starting from as the Harding administration came to power. They were frustrated.
Well, it's dangerous to get into numbers because there's so many of them. But for those who don't follow this story on a day-to-day basis, I wrote down these numbers, that there were 65 million, mostly men, mobilized in World War I to fight, that 15 million deaths, both civilians and soldiers, and 37 million total casualties. So you start with that overwhelming number. Then I want to ask you, we had Woodrow Wilson that took us into World War I and then led and went to the 1919 Paris Versailles Peace Conference. Why did we not sign the treaty?
Because when Wilson came back to ask Congress, it had to be approved by Congress, number one. And when Wilson came back to explain what the treaty was and to have the Senate approve it, the Senate said no. The United States will not join the League of Nations. And that was a battle that went on for the better part of 2 years. You'll remember that Wilson had a stroke during his last term. He was actively campaigning across the United States to build support among the American people to join the League of Nations. At the same time, Knox was leading the campaign for America to not join the League of Nations. And it was a battle. There were several votes, two votes, where the decision whether or not to join the League of Nations was brought before the Senate, and both times they voted against it.
So how much did the Germans owe in reparations to all of the Allied countries as a result of the Treaty of Versailles?
I believe the number that was set by the number was not set in the treaty. And the number wasn't set for 2 years. It was 1921 at the London conference. I think that was May 1921, that the actual number, and it was, I believe it was $132 billion, with the equivalent of $132 billion, was the number set that Germany would be responsible for in reparations.
Who decided that?
It was the Allies got together. They had wrestled with this for several years in hopes, of course, that the United States would come in and help. There were different experiences across the Allies. Of course, Belgium and France sustained extraordinary damage to their land, their infrastructures, in addition to all the men lost. To rebuild their infrastructure and repair the damages was one thing, but just the bitterness over the war, it was very hard for anyone to come together and decide what that number should be. Britain knew that restoring Europe included having to restore the German economy, but Britain also knew that the damage suffered by France and the other allies was so great that they couldn't contemplate really having any possibility of the German economy recovering. They just thought they'd be attacked all over again. They were very fearful of any recovery by Germany. So that was at the heart of the angst that they all endured for several years. But by 1921, all countries knew that the world was literally paralyzed as far as world trade. None of the allies were recovering economically, and war debts and reparations were the big elephant in the room.
Just a reminder that Warren Harding was president for 2.5 years, beginning in 1921. Then Calvin Coolidge, who was his vice president, became president, was reelected once, and then didn't run again. And then you had Herbert Hoover that ran and won. And all through that process up to 32, you had Andrew Mellon as the Secretary of the Treasury. Who felt among those people the strongest about Britain and the rest of the Europeans paying the debt?
The Congress had set up a commission. It was called the World War Foreign Debt Commission. And originally it was comprised of 5 members, which included the Secretary of State, Treasury, Commerce, and 2 members from Congress. That commission realized that the terms that Congress had set for the repayment of debts were impossible. There was absolutely no possibility of the Allies, with the exception of Britain, which was the only solvent debtor the United States had. The other allies would not be able to repay. The commission, therefore, realized its job was to try to find some solution, given that the terms set by Congress were not achievable at all, that they would have to go back to Congress, who required approvals for all the settlements, and persuade them that this was the best course of action. The commission members, because they were privy to the finances of all the allies, essentially had the data, you might say, that the allies really were hurting. And there was a spectrum of opinion. Secretary of State Hughes and Mellon were perhaps the most sympathetic to the allies. Hoover was a more strong form in his belief that the allies really had to repay. But the political will in Congress to force the allies to pay was where it was most strong in the United States. There was absolutely no political will for being flexible in those terms. So the commission realized it was going to have to negotiate first with the allies to get whatever could possibly be worked out in terms of a deal structure. But then they were going to have to go sell it to Congress. And that was the process that unfolded over several years. But the Harding and Coolidge administration very much wanted to make a settlement with Britain first, because of course it was the largest debtor and the only solvent one. And then they thought once they had established that with Congress, they could go back and bring each settlement deal and persuade them that, well, this ally is less strong than Britain, and therefore we've done this. That was their thinking. But there was absolutely no appetite in Congress for the idea of canceling the debts whatsoever.
One of the members of that commission you didn't mention has some relevance to today, and that's Reed Smoot of the
Yes.
Smoot-Hawley
Yes.
tariff issue back in those years. And before this all plays out, he gets the tariff bill. The Depression comes along, and Andrew Mellon is still in the middle of all this once they've been through all this debt problem.
Yes.
By the way, at the end of Mellon's time, I know he was sent to Great Britain as the ambassador. What was he known for when he left the Treasury, and what did people think of him?
In Britain?
No, here.
Or in the United States? Britain, in the political world, Mellon was a public enemy. In the political world, he was, I believe, the least popular person in the United States from any policymaker's point of view. They held him responsible for the Depression. They viewed him as an old man out of his depth, using antiquated thinking, and that he was uncaring. You couldn't imagine someone who is held in lower regard than Andrew Mellon at the end of his term as Treasury Secretary.
Let me read from your book a quote. It's a little complicated, but it kind of sets the discussion for. This is from Winston Churchill, and at this time, I think, and you can explain this after we get through this, the number of times that Mellon and Churchill met. But here's Churchill in a speech saying, We have always held in this country that there are clear distinctions between war debts and commercial debts, Churchill explained. The war debt is incurred for the purposes of self-preservation, but it leaves behind no fertile or reproductive instrument or possession. What is blown away in shot and shell is not comparable to a transaction which leaves behind it, let us say, a railway, a mighty reservoir, or a modern electric plant. Therefore, as you say, he argued, an ordinary commercial debt may raise the standard of living in both the lending and the borrowing countries, and consequently the general welfare of the world. The payment of a war debt, like all war expenditure, however necessary, can only depress the standard of living of the borrowing company. Complicated. Winston Churchill. Why did you use that quote?
Because I thought it was perfect. I believe Churchill is completely correct. I disagree with you. I don't think it's complicated at all. I think his premise that there is a difference between a war debt and a commercial loan is right on the money. I believe that nothing is built from war. Everything is destroyed. Wealth is destroyed in war. A commercial loan is used to build, to create. Mellon was wrong, in my opinion, in arguing that the war debts were commercial loans. They were not commercial loans. There wasn't any private sector entity anywhere in the world that would have made those loans to the Allies. There was no commercial market that the Allies could have borrowed money from. I believed Churchill was right on the money. I thought it was a very important statement he made.
By the reason I call it complicated wasn't because it didn't make sense. It was more that when you read it in a book, it's sometimes a lot easier to understand it than when I'm trying to read it to an audience, which is always, it's sometimes very difficult to translate. But
my apologies. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I wasn't quarreling with it. Anyway, the 5 meetings. But let me start first of all with, why has no one ever written this story, in your opinion?
I believe, well, I think there were several factors. First and foremost, the war of words that was waged between Churchill and Mellon really did threaten Anglo-American relations. And there was a great deal of concern on both sides of the Atlantic about the damage being done over this battle. And one of the meetings between Churchill and Mellon, the 1926 dinner at the Ritz, I really believe it was more of an intervention on the part of concerned government officials, that this, continued battle in the newspapers, so very public, was really threatening Anglo-American relations. And the sad part of this story from my perspective was that you had these 2 great men, brilliant, talented, patriotic, each of them trying to do the best they could for their country. Yet on this issue, they could not find common ground. They just could not find a way to say, how can we work this out? And to have it come to such a heated pitch on the world stage, I believe the reason why at the time, at that dinner, there were 12 people at that dinner. Not one of them mentioned Mellon and Churchill in their papers, in their memoirs, not at all. And I believe it it left such a scar that people thought, well, first of all, it's about numbers, which is never a topic many people really want to get involved in. Second, it was an issue that's very complex from most people's point of view. And third, it did not end well. And so I think people, as historians looked at it, they thought, well, we're not really sure what happened or particularly why. And I think it was just one of those stories that was lost as, well, we don't really know. We know each of them individually, but how they crossed paths was what was lost because war debts was an unattractive issue that had a great deal. It was opaque to many. It was off-putting to others. And there was no happy ending that came from it.
And we have to keep in mind that most of this time that we're talking about, Churchill was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He wasn't the Prime Minister.
Correct.
Who was Prime Minister most of the time? I know there were several of them.
Stanley Baldwin was really of course, he was the one who appointed Churchill, Chancellor of the Exchequer, to the surprise of everyone, including Churchill. And of course, it made Churchill he was now with the Conservative Party. And Baldwin is a really interesting character. I thoroughly enjoyed learning more about him. He introduced Mellon and Churchill and understood both men because Baldwin had come to the United States when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he was the one who negotiated the settlement for Britain with Andrew Mellon. And that settlement took place, a large part of it, in Mellon's residence. And Baldwin had an opportunity to understand Mellon and how Mellon was trying to forge a middle road between the settlements with the Allies and getting Congress to approve them. So Baldwin had the opportunity to truly understand Mellon. Baldwin also understood Churchill because he had seen Churchill as a fellow cabinet member and, of course, understood the position that Britain was in with respect to the war debts and how grave that situation was. And he knew firsthand exactly how Churchill felt about it. So he played a very important role because he knew both men very well.
But off to another part of your book where you're talking about the French throughout this whole thing and what kind of money they owed the United States. And I chuckled when I saw you write that somebody was piped up and said, don't they remember what we did for them during the Revolution? So this thing, it seems to, even with the French, got to be very personal.
It did. And there was, I think what you're referring to is there was some discussion, very brief, in Congress where I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly who brought it up, but they did say, we do owe a debt to the French, and perhaps we should recognize that in trying to settle with them. And those discussions went back and forth. The governments of France were changing very quickly. I think Churchill had 3 or 4 different terms with different counterparts, as did Mellon. The government just couldn't come together to figure out what its best path forward was. It was caught between, abject fear of the recovery of Germany, feeling as though the United States and Britain were leaving it on its own. they were caught in a very difficult position. And so, of course, they had a different approach to the war debts than all the other allies.
Okay, what is convoluted, and you can explain it, I'm sure, is this business of the German reparations, the intertwined react. I mean, the way if you pay here, this pops up over here, and eventually the United States will get the money, but it doesn't come directly from a country. Explain all that.
The name for this is the Dawes Plan, and this was
And who was he?
Charles Dawes. He became Secretary of State. The plan, it was very clear to the United States that there's no possibility of the Allies repaying their war debts. This was 1923, 1924. And when Coolidge came into power, he realized that the United States needed to help the Allies, that the United States needed Europe to recover, specifically as a trading partner. And so the idea of using private sector bankers was born. The idea that people were outside of the government, so that the government wasn't directly working with the Allies on reparations, but that it was providing banking expertise. And the plan that was crafted by Charles Dawes was that the United States would loan money to essentially reconstitute a German government, to allow the German government to then make reparations payments to the Allies, which would then help them economically. And then, of course, the idea was that then they could repay the United States as far as the war debts. And so it became this circular system of payment where the money was coming from the United States, going to Germany to essentially rebuild its central bank, to help rebuild some of its infrastructure, to get its economy going. And therefore, Germany was being overseen by a commission of the Allies and the United States to make sure they used that money to help rebuild their economy, not to rebuild their armies, and also to make sure that they would make their reparations payments to the Allies. The circular component of that was that it became very evident after several years that the money was leaving from the United States to Germany, Germany to the other allies, and then the allies back to the United States. And so that was the circular component. And the intent, though, of the plan was for it to be a temporary plan, just to get the European economies back on track. And that's where it kind of went awry. But the original version for the plan was that it was just meant to be a catalyst to get the European economies working again.
As you were putting this together, what were your thoughts about everybody working so hard to make sure that Germany could rebuild after they were responsible for killing so many French in particular, and Russians, and also the British? I mean, what was the reason, do you think, that everybody worked so hard to put them back on their feet?
Because they needed them. For example, coal. The French needed German coal desperately. Britain needed a trading partner. 4/5 of its food was imported to Britain. They actually needed Germany to recover so that they could recover.
What's the story of the Ruhr? Explain what that is, and the French.
So those are the coal. That's the coal I was referring to. You're absolutely right, Brian. the Ruhr was rich in minerals, coal, everything that France did not have as far as an energy source. And the French, to give you an idea of how critical the Ruhr was to both France and Germany, when Germany in the early years, this is 1923 or so, Germany said, there's no possibility of us making reparations payments, which is a very true statement. And France said, well, that's fine, then we're going to take the Ruhr. And French troops actually went in and occupied the Ruhr to force not only Germany, but the Allies and the United States to get involved, because that's how desperate France really was. It needed help from somewhere, and everyone seemed to be, backing away from France to leave them on their own. And they felt their only course of action was to just occupy the Ruhr, to threaten military action and get everyone back into war, unless the United States, Germany, and all the other allies could work something out that would benefit France.
You may not like this term, but how did you protect yourself in putting a book like this together with so many people, knowing the story of World War I and the historians? Did you have people that were that you would go to have them read this before you published it?
I did not. I just wrote
let it happen.
I just wrote the story, perhaps naively. I felt I had learned a lot. Trying to piece the story together, I ended up admiring so many of the people involved in this story. And I thought perhaps it might make a contribution to our understanding of how important diplomacy is. And giving up on it is tragic, can have tragic consequences. I just thought there might be some lessons learned that might help spark a dialogue or be helpful.
In the end, how long did it take for everybody to pay off their debts? And did everybody do that eventually?
Finland and Hungary did. They were the only two that did repay. The other allies, their debts are still outstanding. And they have been for quite almost 100 years, I guess over 100 years now. But they technically defaulted on their debts.
Did they pay anything?
They did, yes. In the early years, while that circular system was in place, while the United States was providing money to Germany for its recovery, and Germany was making reparation payments, yes, the United States did receive some payments and more debts from some of the allies.
Is there still somebody somewhere trying to get the money out of the allies here in the United States?
To the best of my knowledge, no. Congress, I believe, brought up the issue, I think in the 1970s once. That's perhaps the most recent time it was raised. To the best of my knowledge, no.
Who did you write about that you would like to know?
It's more than one person. I was very impressed with Russell Leffingwell, who had come to serve in the Wilson administration. He went on to be the leader of the Morgan Bank, highly regarded, very thoughtful man. I don't think he's been recognized for his great contribution in trying to shape U.S. policy. I think he is a forgotten hero. On the British side, I think Basil Blackett was another great civil servant who perhaps didn't get his due. These are people who really tried to be constructive in this dialogue back and forth, very thoughtful people who went out on a limb trying to contribute to the dialogue.
The divorce, I know this is off the subject of debts, but you're right about this. The divorce of Andrew Mellon came about because of what?
Well, his wife cheated on him, and she was much younger. She was half Mellon's age. She was British. She had never encountered a city like Pittsburgh. She was from the British countryside. Mellon was a difficult person to understand because he wasn't able to express emotions, and he was very reserved. She was young. She was in her early 20s. It was a bitter divorce. Mellon didn't want to lose his children, particularly with he didn't believe his wife was responsible enough to raise them. And so he waged a very bitter battle to be able to make sure his children were going to be okay.
It's interesting. His daughter, is it pronounced Elsa?
Elsa.
Elsa. She married a name that in my lifetime I've heard a lot of. Who was he, and how did that happen?
She married David Bruce, who is regarded, I believe, as one of our finest ambassadors, a very accomplished man. He fell in love with Elsa, who, interestingly enough, like her father, she had difficulties expressing her emotions. But David Bruce really admired Andrew Mellon. And the two of them had a very positive, warm relationship. It was one of the warmest relationships in Mellon's life. And the difficulty between Elsa and her husband, I believe, stemmed from her difficulty expressing her emotions, just like her father.
He, meaning Andrew Mellon, funded the National Gallery of Art, which is not a part of the Smithsonian, interestingly enough. Everybody thinks it is, but it's not. It's separate and distinct. But I read that his son, Paul, and I'm not sure whether it was also his daughter, went on to build the East building of the Gallery of Art. Anything more you can tell us about why they were so interested in this and how much money they spent?
You're right. It was both Elsa and her brother Paul who underwrote the building of the East Wing of the National Gallery of Art. Mellon had actually acquired the land that the East Wing sits on at the time of making the gift to the United States. So that piece of land had been reserved for that purpose by Andrew Mellon. And Elsa and Paul followed through on building that. They not only underwrote the construction of it, but of course, both of them made major contributions of their own personal art collectors. They both were very serious art collectors, and both of them gave most of their art collections to the National Gallery.
I want to go back before we close one issue. You say that there were 5 meetings between. I never nailed you down on this earlier. 5 meetings between Mellon and Churchill. First, I want to know, did they ever talk to each other at these meetings?
They did.
Did they negotiate at these meetings?
They did not negotiate because they did not meet until after the settlement. The British settlement had been executed by Stanley Baldwin and Andrew Mellon. Interestingly enough, it was just months after that settlement that Baldwin introduced Mellon and Churchill at Westminster Abbey. There was a ceremony celebrating Anglo-American friendship, interestingly enough. And they were in a very intimate space, dedicating a plaque that Britain had made to be put in the chapter house at Westminster Abbey to honor the American ambassador to Britain during the war years, Walter Page. And Mellon and Churchill were in a small group of perhaps 20 people in a very small space, and that's where Baldwin introduced them. So they had plenty of time to talk, not about the settlement. Well, they could have talked about the settlement, but they had plenty of time to meet each other, size each other up, and have some polite conversation. That was their first meeting.
And Churchill was 19 years younger than
exactly he was
than Mellon. Where were there other meetings? I know wasn't there a vacation that you write a lot about Andrew Mellon's vacation, and everybody kept thinking he was here in Great Britain to negotiate.
Which he was not. The settlements were almost all either executed or about to be executed. And Mellon actually really was on a summer vacation, but because of the upset over the war debts, the Allies were hopeful that Mellon would come and renegotiate them. But also the bitter war was going on between Churchill and Mellon in the papers over war debts, with Churchill still, lobbying the world, trying to change public opinion that those war debts really needed to be canceled. And so their next meeting was the dinner at the Ritz. That's 1926, where they were sitting at a table, 12 people, and Mellon gave a little talk at the beginning of the dinner. I'm sure they raised glasses. They had plenty of times to talk there as well. The other 3 meetings they had, the next 2 meetings were more formal, where Churchill was coming. He was coming to the United States on a book tour, and he was paying a courtesy call on the administration. And so he and Mellon were at a lunch together. They would have obviously had plenty of time to talk there. And on another book tour, I'm pretty sure they did not talk, but they were certainly in each other's on each other's radar screens, you might say. The last meeting, they sat side by side at a very big dinner, so they had the entire evening to talk to one another.
When Andrew Mellon was the ambassador to Great Britain, who was the prime minister? Do you remember? 1932.
Sorry, his name's just gone out of my mind. I apologize.
Well, it's very hard to keep track of all of them.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I believe it was a Labor prime minister. Sorry.
Was it McDonald? It doesn't matter. I mean,
sorry.
To close it off, what about your background? When did you work at the Treasury Department, and what did you do?
I had an appointment. I was brought in as a credit analyst. This was in the years just after the global financial crisis, and Congress had put together they were trying to deploy capital into the smaller banks after having spent a lot of time trying to save the big banks. They now wanted to stimulate loans, lending by the smaller banks as a way to create jobs. And so I was brought in to help develop the credit analysts' decision making on which banks would be the banks best able to repay taxpayers, and having the U.S. government extend taxpayer money to them.
Where'd you get your education?
I started at Wellesley College, and was very, very grateful. It has been a gift, a life gift to me.
What did you major in?
Not history or economics. I was French and biology.
And are you still with the Bipartisan Policy Center?
No, I'm not. That was a great experience to learn a lot about policymaking from an entirely different perspective.
And what are you doing now full time besides this book?
I haven't quite finished. There's still some research that came from this project that I have to follow through on, and it involves the National Gallery of Art. I'm hopeful to make a contribution to that story. So that's what's on my desk right now.
This book is called Mellon versus Churchill, the untold story of Treasury titans at war. Jill Eicher is our guest, and we thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.